Israel somehow lost more in the eyes of the world than Hamas has. Here to debate that is Ben Shapiro. He's the editor-in-chief of truthrevolt.org, and Rula Jabrial, a foreign policy analyst and author of the novel Miral. Thanks to both of you for being here. Ben, I want to start with you. Is it your impression that in the court of public opinion that Israel has somehow taken more of a hit during these 27 days than Hamas has?
There's no question. I mean, Hamas is a terrorist group, and people going in understood Hamas to be a terrorist group. Israel, thanks to outlets like CNN, has been turned into the villain in this particular scenario, and a moral equivalency has been drawn between the two groups. If Hamas could have come up with any sort of outlet that could have created a will to kill more Jewish babies and Palestinian babies, CNN would have been it. I mean, CNN is a key factor in drawing the same sort of equivalency that Hamas hopes to win.
Hold on a second. I just want to stop you right there, because you're saying that because CNN has interviewed Palestinian families and shown Palestinian children who have been wounded or killed, that somehow CNN is saying that Hamas is okay. I don't think that those two are equivalent. We're not allowed to show the civilians caught in the crossfire?
Of course you're allowed to show civilians caught in the crossfire. You should also mention all the restrictions that Hamas puts on your reporting inside the Gaza Strip. You should also mention all the context with regard to Hamas putting children in harm's way. You should also routinely mention the fact that Hamas's charter calls for the destruction not only of the state of Israel, but for the murder of Jews across the world, which, of course, CNN does not.
That's silly, Ben. We talk about that all the time. We talk about the charter, the Hamas charter that says that they want to obliterate Israel and wipe Israel off the face of the map. You're just not being fair. That's not true. Our reporters on the ground do say that.
You mention it occasionally in the midst of vast swaths of imagery about Israel using what you would term excessive force.
Rula, what's your impression of what's going on these past 27 days?
I think Ben is not in a position to really lecture us about extremism, especially after what he said about President Obama when he called him a Jew hater, when he called him anti-Semitic, and when he called for the expulsion of Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza, and Arab Israelis like myself as a solution. You know, it's so hard to listen to somebody that even Jeffrey Goldberg called a fascist. Saying that, I think the issue about the public opinion will be connected to what happened, especially after the schools, the UN schools that were hit by the Israelis 7 times after UN officials told Israelis more than once, actually 35 times, they told Israelis, the IDF, that they have civilians inside of that school. This is what turned the public opinion against the action of Israel. Of course, Israel has the right to defend itself against terrorist attacks, but every time that they kill one Hamas leader or one Hamas militant, with him they are killing at least 10 civilians. So the public opinion is asking, what is the end game here? And after killing 2,000 civilians, or 2,000 people, is Israel really more secure and safe?
Let's try to avoid the inflammatory comments about each other and the ad hominem attacks, because what we're trying to get at is whether or not the U.S. impression, the general opinion in the U.S. has been fair towards Israel. And Ben, I hear what you're saying. You think that it has not been, particularly when celebrities like Javier Bardem and his wife Penelope Cruz issue open letters condemning Israel and saying that they have engaged in genocide, but they don't mention Hamas. I think you're wrong about the media. I believe certainly that CNN has shown both sides, but there is an impression, Ben, and I understand why you feel this way, that certainly when it comes to celebrities, that they're giving Hamas a pass.
Well, and this, I think, is sort of the point with regard to showing both sides. When you're showing two sides as equivalent, and your idea of balance is to show Israel's side and then Hamas's side and then claim that balance has been achieved, well, that's the sort of media coverage that would have led to the West losing World War II. So I'm not a big fan of that sort of balance.
You're the one who's actually equating Hamas and Palestinian civilians. Those are not equal.
The hell I am.
Why would you do that? Hamas is a terror. Because you're saying that when the media shows civilians being killed, they're somehow propping up Hamas. That's not true.
That is not what I said.
You're saying...
I did not say that at all. I said you feel free to show civilians being killed. What I suggested is that you should provide all the context for those civilians being killed. And as far as the other woman who's on with me, I'm not familiar with her name. You know, as far as her personal insults, I mean, I'm not going to get into the quality of the movies that are made based on her books. I think that we can all stay away from that.
Rula.
Well, let's talk about reality and realpolitik and stay away from really ideology and hate, I would say. Look, Israel negotiated with Hamas more than once. The last time and the most striking one was in 2011 when they released 1,000 Hamas prisoners for one Israeli soldier. Let the public opinion, especially the Palestinian public opinion, believe if you use violence, we negotiate with you. While the PA, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, recognized Israel, renounced violence, and got nothing in exchange. And today the world is asking, what can we do about this issue and move it in a context where we talk about occupation and blockade?
But Rula, I mean,
as solutions.
But to your point, Rula, I mean, wouldn't it just help if Hamas decided to stop trying to wipe Israel off the face of the earth? I mean, that's the non-starter. Isn't that, it's impossible to negotiate with them given that?
Look, Israel negotiated with Hamas, but look, let's look at history. Americans and the British negotiated with IRA when they were considered an extremist terrorist group that would blow up schools, if we remember, and actually they signed a peace deal with them, and they agreed on a peace deal, and they brought peace to Northern Ireland. So this is the way you negotiate with your enemies, not with your friends. And finally, you can put that in context. Why we have cyclical violence? It's because of the occupation and because of the blockade.
All right. Obviously, you both have very interesting and differing perspectives. Ben Shapiro, Rula Jabal, thank you for being here. We'll talk to you again.
Thank you for having us.
Also, I will say this is a pretty good crowd. Apparently, the meeting at which they were organizing, according to Facebook, it had 6 RSVPs. So, socialism, wildly successful wherever it goes. So tonight I want to talk about speaking from a common basis of fact. One of the big problems in our country right now, one of the big problems with our political discourse, is that folks are not operating from the same realm. They're not even making fact-based arguments anymore. One side screams something, the other side screams something back, and usually these are factless contentions about the state of the world, conclusory statements that have no root in reality. And one of the big problems with that is that when proof is then given of a particular position, this is considered offensive. If you say something like men are men and women are women, then this is automatically considered offensive because we are not operating within the same realm of reality. We're not operating on the same factual basis. We've not defined any of our terms. We've not talked about the parameters of the debate. And what this leads to is a lot of people who are very, very angry at each other. And before you can even have a political conversation about how the country ought to be run or about how you believe society ought to operate, you first have to be operating within the same factual framework. And so tonight what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and give you a bunch of facts, a bunch of factual statements that are based on studies, based on evidence, and then I'll draw my conclusions from them. And then if folks want to argue with the conclusions, then we can do that. And they can marshal their evidence, and they can explain where they think that my logic has gone wrong. But if we don't do that, if instead we just stand up and shout at each other slogans without any relevance to the public discourse, then we're not advancing the debate in any serious way. We're not having a discussion. We're just having a yelling contest. So I'm going to say a bunch of stuff. The stuff is probably going to be controversial because facts are now controversial. But fortunately, as we all know, facts don't care about people's feelings. So let's begin with the fact that is the most controversial fact on college campuses these days because sensitivities are very high and we want everybody to be treated with dignity, which is a good thing. But you can treat people with dignity while also respecting the realities of life. Okay, so let's start with a very simple fact. There are 2 sexes. There are not 9, there are not 11, there are not 15. There are 2. Okay? There are men and there are women. Now, the fact that a statement that literally my 2.5-year-old understands can elicit massive applause from an audience of over 1,000 people betrays how controversial this basic factual proposition has become. But it is indeed a basic factual proposition. Men cannot become women. Women cannot become men. Men who believe they are women are not in fact women, which means that transgender women are not real women. Okay, when people say transgender women are real women, they are making a contention about the state of the world that is simply not true. If you want to say that transgender women are men who have a condition in which they believe they are women, if you want to say that they are experiencing female gender, and then you can define gender in some way that somehow makes sense. If you want to do that, that's fine. But if you want to make the argument that men can become women and women can become men, and that you can use interchangeably transgender women and women, then you are making a statement about the world that has no factual basis. Okay, there are two sexes. People with a Y chromosome are almost universally male. People without a Y chromosome are almost universally female. The only exceptions, and the reason why I'm using almost in those sentences, is there is variation in a very tiny percentage of the population. These folks are intersex, and they may have primary or secondary sexual characteristics that do not match the presence or absence of a Y chromosome. This is not a third sex. These are called genetic abnormalities. Okay, they exist in virtually every aspect of life. In every aspect of biology, any statement that you make biologically speaking, there will be exceptions to that rule. That does not mean the rule does not exist. If somebody is born without a working kidney, that does not mean that kidneys generally do not perform certain functions. It means that certain people have a disorder of the kidney. Okay, if people are born intersex, this means they have a genetic abnormality, not that they're not males and they're not females. Mammals are based on dichotomous sexual differences. Human procreation is based on these dichotomous sexual differences. This is uncontroversial in biological circles. But because people have decided they want a particular political outcome to a particular political debate, they've decided to go back in and rewrite the science. Transgender advocates claim that no evidence has to be shown of intersex genetics in order to determine if a person is indeed transgender. So that argument doesn't even make any sense. What folks on the transgender right side will say is they will very often say things like, well, there is a third sex, and that third sex is made up of people who don't match their chromosomal status. Okay, that is true, but that is not the claim that is made by transgender advocates. They say that even if you are fully biologically female in every possible way without an intersex condition, you can still be a male. Okay, this obviously makes no sense. A perfectly normal biological male in terms of genetics cannot in fact be a